everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bigfoot Tales. I'm your host, Dan, coming to you from the coast of Maine, and got another story from you, coming from the backwoods of Maine. It's a story that was published in a book called The Adventures of Six Young Men in the Wilds of Maine and Canada. It's one of the Knockabout Club series stories for young adult men. Written and published right around 1880. So again, this is a pretty old story. It's an interesting story that tells of a being that was shot at a wangan at a lumbercamp up in the backwoods of Maine. And again, this is fictionalized, but one of the things I found about C.A. Stevens is it's quite likely that a lot of the stories that he fictionalized are actually reworked life experience stories that he receives from other people. But we'll get into that later. It's a longish type of story, so I'm gonna get right into the tale here without boring you to death with all kinds of stuff that only folklorists are interested in. Again, the subtitle of this particular story is called The Woods Demon, and to set the story up is these young men were on a tour through the backwoods of Maine, up through the Saguenay and back through the Winneniche and over across to the other side of Aroostook, and back down through the backwoods of Maine. And they spent some time at a lumber camps that had been deserted. And there was a story that was relayed to them by a guide that they were working with named Nugent. And that story is actually about the haunted logging camp. And we'll get right into it. And again, this is Nugent telling these young men the story. So this is like a third or fourth person tale. So here we go. The haunted logging camp. There were 17 choppers and 4 teamsters beside the foreman and cook in our crew that winter at the camp over here. 23 men in all, partly French and more than half of them Catholics. In February, towards the last of the month, after they had been in the woods 13 weeks, there came on at night one of those fearful northeast snowstorms such as are known only in British America and Siberia. Overhead, the wind roared and shook the treetops, and the snow, fine as meal, was sifted blindingly down through the frozen boughs. So full was the air of snow that the voices of the men seemed muffled as they came in from their work. In an hour and a half, a foot of snow had fallen, and the old loggers predicted a fall of 4 feet by morning. But, gathered before the fire in their warm log camp, saluted by the savor of a bountiful supper, the hardy fellows cared little for the terrors of the storm outside. Supper was nearly ready, and Lottie, the cook, had taken up the 3-gallon teapot to fill when he discovered the supply of tea was out. If there was any tea drank that night, it would be necessary for someone to go down to the wangan on the riverbank, half a mile below. The wangan, or storehouse, was a strong structure of heavy logs, wherein was kept the winter supply of flour, pork, sugar, molasses, etc., which had been pulled up the river in bateaux before the ice had formed. Leading down to it from the camp, there was a road cut through the timber. The men, however, generally avoided going there after dark. There were wolves about, and the loup cervier of that section are remarkably large and fierce. Bidding them wait patiently a little while, Lotte began to muffle himself with a tramp, when one of the French boys, a youngster of 20, named Marc Lizotte, offered to go in his place. Lotte very thankfully handed him the key and a basket, and Marc set off at a run through the snow. He had been gone scarcely 10 minutes, when terrified shouts startled the camp. The men rushed to the door. Hardly had they opened it, when Lizotte leaped in among them, shouting, "Frappe la porte! Frappe la porte! Pardieu!" 1 or 2 of the men declared that they had heard a hoarse cough at the same moment, close at hand, but it might have been the wind. They saw nothing, and all cried out, "What is it?" "I don't know," panted Marc. "Je crois que c'est le diable lui-même." A laugh followed this honest avowal. The boy said that he had come within a few rods of the wangan when, distinctly above the roar of the storm, he heard heavy blows, as of someone pounding on the door with an axe or club. He stopped short, and peering sharply through the darkness, made out the form of a man, as he had first thought, breaking in at the door. He watched a moment, then called out to know what he was doing there. Instantly the creature turned, uttered a most unearthly cry, and sprang after him with the uplifted club. Mark ran for his life. He said that the tison d'enfer, as he called it, had chased him to the very door of the camp, and at one time was almost at his heels. Many of the men ridiculed the whole story. Mark got scared, they said. Others thought it might have been a thief, or some wandering hunter, possibly an Indian, who had tried to break into the wangan. 3 or 4 were for going down, but the boss said that nobody could break through the locked door, even with an axe, and as it was storming fiercely, none cared to make the trip in the snow and darkness. Early next morning, 3 of us on snowshoes set off to get tea and look for traces of Mark's bugbear. We found them easily enough. The wangan door was broken open, the great bolt wrenched from its socket, and the huge doorpost split and splintered. The snow had drifted in. It was not without many cautious glances that we ventured to enter. The room was empty. So far as we could discover, nothing of value had been stolen. From one of the open barrels of pork, a chunk had been taken out, gnawed, and the remnant thrown into the snow. That was all. The snow had covered the tracks, both Mark's and the creature's. We should have believed it the work of some wild beast, but from the fact that no wild beast could have broken in that door. This happened on Tuesday. The next Sunday, 2 of the choppers, named Leverett and Corbain, went out to hunt a caribou, the tracks of which we had lately seen in the snow near where we had been felling timber. About 3 in the afternoon, they came back and told a curious story. They had come upon the caribou not an hour after starting out, but it had run off through the snow, and they had to follow it an hour or two before getting near enough to shoot at it with the old musket they had carried from the camp. Finally they fired. Wounded the animal so severely that, after running a little way, it fell on the snow. They had no difficulty in killing it. Leverett then began to skin and cut up the carcass, with a view to take the best portions of the meat back to camp. While thus engaged, they heard a trampling of the snow and looked up and saw a géant, so Corbain called it, coming towards them, snuffling horribly and brandishing a great bludgeon. Leverett dropped his knife. They had not stopped to reload the old musket, and both he and Corbain ran away as fast as they could. They described the creature as a monster, a giant, bare-headed and bare-legged, with matted hair, but wearing, they thought, the skin of a bear about its shoulders and body. Its arms were bare, brown, and hairy, and so also was its face, and the hair on its head was thickly matted and stood up in a frightful tuft. We could scarcely believe so queer a story. Several of the men openly ridiculed it. 8 or 9 took their axes and followed Leverett and Corbain back to where they had shot the caribou. They easily found the spot, but the carcass of the caribou had been dragged away. They followed the trail in the snow for a mile or 2, and then, as night was coming on, turned back. Of course, there was plenty of talk and surmise. The French boys would hardly stir out of camp alone, and the province men teased them continually. A few nights after, the wangan was broken into again. The boss had repaired the damage done the door by the former attack, and strengthened it by 2 new bars of green ash, a foot in width and 4 inches thick. This time the hinges were torn out of the post, and the door wrenched outward, leaving the bars intact. But, as before, only a few chunks of pork were missing. It was plain to anybody that it must have taken prodigious strength to pull out the hinge irons, fastened and clenched as they were to the doorpost. The men began to look serious and to talk less about it. That day, 4 of us province men agreed to go to the wangan and watch for the man, creature, or whatever it was. The boss was willing. We quit work early, got our supper, and went down to the wangan a little after sunset. We took our axes and the old gun, which we used to shoot game with, loaded with slugs. Going inside, we pulled the door together and drove the hinge irons back into the post, and then barricaded it on the inside with barrels of flour. There was a number of bales of hay in the wangan. We cut open one of these and, piling the hay against the front side, lay down on it, first pulling the moss out from between the logs so that we could look out. It was still, clear night with a new moon, which soon set behind the treetops, leaving it dim, yet not very dark. The names of the three men with me were Hanley, Carnize, and Foley. Evening passed tediously enough, for it was pretty cold lying there with fire. Nothing stirred about the wangan till after 11 o'clock, when I heard steps in the snow at some distance. I whispered to my mates, and we listened intently. The steps came nearer. We peered out between the cracks, but it was too dark to discern objects off in the woods. A moment later, Foley muttered under his breath, "There he is." And then I saw a dark, indistinct figure not 20 yards from the wangan. For some moments it stood there motionless, then slowly came up to the door. It seemed to be the form of a very large man, but even in the darkness we perceived that he was half naked and of strange mien. We noiselessly got on our feet, grasping our axes, Carnize holding the gun. I confess to have been a little scared. There was a sound as of nails on the door, then a heavy push against it, which made it crack and the barrels rattle. "Who's there?" shouted Hanley. For a reply there was a kind of a snort, followed by a tremendous blow from some heavy instrument. At the same instant there came a blaze of fire and a stunning report. The old gun had gone off in Carnize's hands. He was holding it cocked, and it went off itself, he said. As soon as we recovered from our flurry, I looked through the cracks and could see nothing of our disturber, and after looking and waiting an hour or more, we ventured out and went up to the camp, for it had grown unbearably cold. Our story re-excited the French boys very much. 2 nights after, one of them saw, or fancied he saw, the creature stealing up behind him as he came in from the ox camp, a few rods back of our shanty. Then the terrors took voice. They were going to leave and get out of that place. Parbleu! 'Twas the devil himself. The foreman, Lamson, was used to the French. It may be the devil, he said, and started 4 of them off to the settlement after a priest. He knew that the presence of a priest was the only way to keep the gang from bolting. When once these French Catholics are scared, nothing can quiet them but a priest. The night after the priest was sent for, we were roused up, about 1 o'clock in the morning, by a tremendous uproar at the ox camp. It was a great racket, and the oxen were bellowing terribly. "Some of them are loose and goring the others," Lamson exclaimed, and half a dozen of us turned out to quiet the hubbub. Foley was ahead. The great door of the ox camp was open. This circumstance of itself ought to have warmed us, but we were too stupid with sleep to reflect. As Foley entered the doorway, something struck him on the head and knocked him down, senseless. A blow was also aimed at Corbin, but he jumped aside, and we all ran back to the shanty for our lives. Lamson caught up the gun. The rest took their axes and rushed out. We found Foley lying in the snow. He was beginning to stir a little. There was a fearful cut on his head, but whatever had struck him was gone. The ox camp contained nothing but the oxen. One of them was bleeding from his nose profusely and kept shaking his head as if stunned by blows. That same night the wangan was again broken into and more pork taken. Nothing now but the expected arrival of the priest kept the Frenchers from stampeding. The provost men kept quiet. They did not know what to say or think. Lamson spent the afternoon, gun in hand, looking about the woods for signs and tracks. There had no snow fallen for over a week. Our own track and those of the teams had trodden the snow hard about the camp, but out in the woods, Lamson found in many places the print of a large moccasin foot. It left no heel print. The boots and moccasins worn by the men had raised heels. That afternoon, the boss called Carnize and myself off from work an hour or more before sunset. "I want you 2 men to go down to the wangan for me," he said. We went to the shanty and then set off for the wangan, Lamson taking the gun. "I'll know whether this critter is flesh or blood or not," he said as we went down. "I'm going to set a spring gun for him. It doesn't act like a man, but if it isn't a man, what can it be? At any rate, he's a murderous wretch. Devil or not, I'm going to try a charge of slugs on him. We helped Lanson set the gun inside the wangan, with a line running from the trigger across the doorway, and the muzzle pointed at about breast height to the person entering the door. The door itself we left just as it had been found that morning, wrenched outward and forced back on the outside. Lamson told the men at supper what we had done, and bade them keep away from the wangan. Folling was getting better of his wound. So much had the setting of the gun and the attendant circumstances excited me that I did not go to sleep that night, but lay thinking and listening. The night wore on. It was not till after 2 in the morning that the gun was sprung. Its dull, heavy report startled me, and set me trembling all over. All the men were expecting it, and seemed to be but half asleep. In a moment, everybody was astir. Lanson went to the door. We fetched him, he explained, and going out, we could plainly hear cries as of one in pain and rage. The French boys refused to stir out of the shanty, but the most of the province men set off for Lamson, who had lighted a lantern. The cries burst out at intervals as we hurried down the wangan path. It was with strange feelings that we approached the place. By the light of the lantern, we saw the brown, hairy body of a man, half covered with a bear hide, lying just outside the door. There had been a desperate struggle. The 5 slugs with which Lamson had charged the gun had pierced him through and through, but he died only after many struggles and outcries. I had never imagined anything like the ferocious expression of the face. The skin of the body was very brown, and much covered with hair. The legs, especially, were almost shaggy. The feet were tied up, each in the hide of a lynx, and the bear hide hung down from his shoulders, fastened with a thick thong around the neck. There was no other clothing. Both arms and legs were rough, dirty, almost horny. The face was repulsive, and the hair matted. Though lean, the body must have weighed fully 200 pounds. It was every indication of great physical strength, instances of which we had certainly seen. Nearby lay a large, greasy bludgeon, between 3 and 4 feet long, which must have weighed 10 or 12 pounds. The idea which we settled on was that it was a backwoodsman, half-breed Indian, perhaps. It was hard telling, who had years before gone crazy. But chance he had been lost in the woods, and had gone on leading a wandering life, eating raw flesh for food, till the man had well-nigh changed to a fierce animal. Instances are known to lumbermen where persons getting lost in the woods become deranged. That night, the men from the foreman had sent down to the settlement came back, and a priest came with them. The corpse of the madman we had killed was put into a roughly constructed coffin and buried in the snow. Lamont asked the priest, whose name was Valade, whether he wished to conduct a funeral service over the body. He declined to do so. Lamson then asked what he thought of what we had done, and whether he deemed it a mere murder. And to this question he made no reply. The next morning, after hearing confessions from the French boys, he went back, taking 2 men as guides, and these men did not return. But the general opinion of the men was that this was not a murder, and that such as a being as this man had better be put out of the way than suffered to go at large in the woods. And such was Nugent's story. And that's the end of our tale for today. And just a couple of points here is, again, want to reiterate that a lot of these stories that come from this gentleman seem to have been second-hand stories or third-hand stories that have been repurposed or adapted for his books. And in this particular one, it would certainly take somebody with a really twisted mind to be able to live in the cold winters of Maine, pretty much naked as he was. But the general description of the body, being fully covered with hair, considered to be a giant, they estimated him to be about 200 pounds. But if he was that big and he was powerful enough to wrench apart the door constructed as it was described as having been constructed, I think we're probably talking more like somebody that's probably more like 400 to 500 pounds easily. Yeah, that green wood is pretty strong, and the way they built those wangans in those days is they would take a spike, instead of a screw, drive it all the way through until it stuck out the other end of the timber that it was pounded into, and then clinch it, bend it so that you wouldn't be able to easily pull the nails out or spikes. So it would take incredible strength to be able to pull that out like that. Strength that a normal man wouldn't have. So, but that's the story. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you think that might have been a Bigfoot killed at a lumber camp in Maine or not. And hope you enjoyed this Bigfoot tale, and until next time, I hope you subscribe and come back for more Bigfoot tales. And until then, happy squatching.